Hi, I'm John Atack. I'm delighted to welcome my dear friend Joe szimhart.
Hello, John.
Hi, Joe. Who has amazing stories to tell. So start us in again. You've done these two book reviews and there's incredible tapestry of information around them.
Yeah. So, John, as I was talking earlier, I reviewed these two books. Mainly, I've been interested in the work of James Webb, who passed away at a young age in 1980. And he initially, his first book was called Flight from Reason. And it came out in 1971, and it's about the occult. It later got released as this book called The Occult Underground with some editing in it. But these are basically the same book, you know, same territory. So Webb fascinated me because he was one of the first skeptical historians of the occult. And his thesis was that, you know, people had thought, at least the intelligentsia had thought, that since the age of reason, religion was shrinking. You know, especially in the 19th century, there was this whole kind of shrugging off of all this religion, and because the reasonable people weren't believing in it anymore. Webb's thesis was it did not go away. You know, it manifested itself in many, many forms, including, you know, what became fundamentalist Christianity during this century, the last century, but also in what's called the Occult Underground. And he documents all of this, you know, from the Rosicrucians to the Freemasons to Eliphas Levi to Madame Blavatsky and her circle, and all of that influence that was going on in the 19th century and into the 20th, and then how all of that became the establishment, you know, with anthroposophy and theosophical groups influencing politics in India, for instance. You know, the Agni Yoga Society that I was part of was very influential politically, although Webb doesn't cover that. But that became the establishment. And so today we have a lot of new religious groups, the explosion of the New Age and whatever, which are part of that old occult underground.
Yes.
The idea that you can use some kind of a mind science to affect reality. You don't need to have physical science. You can do it with your mind.
Of course, right? The most successful of all of the occult groups was the Nazis. You know,
yes, in many ways, it undergirded a lot of what became them. And of course, the Nazis relied on their philosophy, which was fascism, that came out of the futurist movement. And Marinetti, his Futurist Manifesto in 1909, defines what later became fascism and Nazism.
And they pulled ideas from Madame Blavatsky, their idea of Aryanism, all of this, and sought to create super beings, which most people don't know, that, you know, the lebensborn under Himmler was designed to make people, you know, kids who would be born with supernatural powers. And like the ascended masters coming into being through breeding. You know, this was a breeding thing, like you would breed dogs, you know, to become super dogs. Of course, one lebensborn child did become famous. I don't remember which one she is, but the dark-haired woman in ABBA was a lebensborn child.
Right.
I don't think she has superpowers, but she can boogie.
Well, it all depends how you define superpower, John. Come on.
It all depends how you find boogie as well. You know, she's on the Zimmer now. You know.
So this lady, Joyce Collin-Smith, was deep into the Gurdjieff teachings when she was young. When she was 16, she read the Steiner books, Rudolf Steiner. So she was already, you know, influenced by this world of the occult. And she had connections to the Fourth Way through her husband, Drew Collin-Smith, who was the brother of Rodney Collin-Smith. And Rodney was one of the top disciples of P.D. Ouspensky, who linked up with Gurdjieff in the Fourth Way groups. Rodney, and this is what Webb was interested in, because Joyce he was an ex-member of all this and had firsthand information in the 70s about all of this. So what Joyce did as a younger woman, married, but her brother-in-law, Rodney, went to Mexico to start a commune after Ouspensky died. Now, Ouspensky decided to die what's called a conscious death. And what that means is he was terminally ill. He wasn't doing well. He was quite depressed, but he wanted to be alert. He didn't take any medication, and he wanted to keep moving, doing something. And he was actually walking when he collapsed with witnesses around him. And he died as alert as he could be because he felt that his energies would be intact in the other world more and could move on and, whatever the hell he was thinking. But this is what he wanted.
I've read that Ouspensky's last words were, start with something simple, start with something and that he rejected his own teaching at that last moment. And
he essentially, you're right, he essentially dissolved the group. And, in a similar way, you could go back to Buddha, and he, at the end of his life, he said, you have to forge your own path or something of that nature.
Yes.
So Joyce here, tall woman, she was 6 feet tall, blue-eyed. Rodney Collin-Smith was well over 6 feet. He was quite tall too. Yeah. So was Webb. Webb had bright red hair. He was well over 6 feet tall. So, these three people are interlinked here. And she decides to go down and join Rodney in his commune in Mexico. And Rodney had taken the fourth way ideas and spread them even more deeply into a form of Catholicism. He blended astrology into it. And he had a medium that joined the group down there, a Mexican woman that was kind of channeling or impressing him quite a bit with her otherworldly information. And, all of this miasma he was forging into a new consciousness, a new form of teaching. It got pretty intense. They went down to Cusco in Peru, 1956, where he was going through a lot of distress, and he met this young boy, Mexican boy, that was crippled, and he had pity on him, and he had this idea apparently that he was going to help him somehow. And he took him up to a bell tower of a cathedral, a tall cathedral there. And the boy, reiterated this. Collin-Smith apparently, Rodney Cullen is what he went by, Rodney Cullen. He apparently just stood on the ledge with his arms out and let himself fall and landed, crushed his legs and his chest and head and died. And this, people believe, was his effort to have a conscious death, which is something that, they didn't want to call it suicide. Inadvertently, he was thinking apparently that this would miraculously, he would take on the pain of the boy, and the boy would be miraculously healed or transformed. What actually happened in real life was the group was shocked by what happened with Rodney, but at the same time sympathetic to this young kid who had run away scared because he saw this guy leaping from the tower. And they fundraised for him and got operations for him to help him heal. So somehow this bizarre event led to a bit of healing for this kid.
So on the other hand, he probably was traumatized for the rest of his life by what he'd witnessed in the bell tower. So
yes, I don't know how he figured all that out. So back to Webb. By the way, I had to order this book from a bookseller in Germany because it's been way out of print, and it cost me like $45 to buy this thing. I saw it for sale for $172 also. So the first edition is a rare book. Yeah. But I kind of enjoyed this guy's story. But to get back to Webb, what happened to him the last 2 years of his life, he fell into a kind of existential depression. And he had all these occult ideas swimming around in his head, and he was quite skeptical and trying to frame them in a skeptical way. But some of it was making sense, because it does. There's certain things, like Gurdjieff said, which make sense. That's the bait that gets you in, right? Truth, in other words, he was expounding some truth mixed in with his other bizarre ideas about how to control human behavior. So Webb was married to Mary Webb at the time, and she thought all of his research was rubbish, didn't have any sympathy with this stuff. And she was a journalist. she, during his distress and even at one point psychosis, he was in a hospital and was given antipsychotics. He was that bad off. She tried to get him to work, and so he took on this job as a copywriter, a boring job, for a few months, and it didn't help. It made it worse, made his condition worse. Yeah. He began to write letters to Joyce Collin-Smith that she's published, since, and of his distress. So we have an idea what was going on in his head, and it was all esoteric stuff. What's real, what's not. He was looking at Gnosticism and how maybe that was real. He was almost in a manic state. And so one day in early in 1980, in May, I think it was, of 1980, after his book came out, The Harmonious Circle was published, he took a shotgun and put it to his temple and pulled the trigger and died. Now, the question is, was he trying to imitate the conscious death, in his craziness, or did he just lose it and decided he couldn't live anymore and took his life? It was a horrible ending for a brilliant young man whose books influenced Goodrich Clark,
Yes.
Used Webb's research quite a bit to develop his ideas on Nazi occultism and so forth. So I wrote a review of this and kind of examined, what is going on in someone's mind, and also, how dangerous it is to some extent to get tangled up in this stuff. It's crazy making.
Yes.
To get involved in a fourth way cult if you've gone too far with it. These ideas are beyond human comprehension, yet the gurus claim they have something that can help you comprehend it. That's where the kicker is. And they usually do it through some kind of experience, some movements of the body, some meditative ritual, some drug taking, submission to the master. No matter what he says to do, you have to do it in order to break down your ego so that this flood of awareness comes in and that you can call enlightenment. It's just an old game. It's been going on for a long time.
For sure.
And if you look back at a few of the greater teachers, the Buddha cautioned against this metaphysical speculation. He avoided it, in fact. He wouldn't answer questions
the
about
poisoned arrow doctrine, yes.
Yeah. And whereas people like Gurdjieff, and the Maharishi, who Joyce Collin-Smith was one of the early followers of him. She was his personal assistant.
Yeah.
Before he met
I read it back when it came out, and
and so she knew him before he met the Beatles met him, and Mick Jagger met him.
To the UK, in about
exactly
63.
And she noticed how dark his energy was. He would do stuff like lock his room when he had young white women in there to so-called counsel or teach. So he was doing the sexy Sadie stuff for quite a while. It was nothing new.
Yeah.
When the Beatles discovered it. Which they wrote that song "Sexy Sadie" about him, I think.
Yes, it is reported as such. There's some conversation as to whether they found him with a young woman or not.
I think it was Mia Farrow's sister that they allegedly.
Prudence, dear Prudence from the White House.
Dear Prudence was that. That's exactly right. Yeah. So that's Webb in a nutshell. What happened to him. He did this incredible research, got tangled up in the web of the occult. Someone wrote that monograph analyzing what happened to Webb, and he uses the writings of Cullen Wilson, who did the preface to Joyce's book, and Gary Lackman, who's lately come on as kind of a historian, apologist for all of these gurus and occultists. He wrote a quite interesting book on Rudolf Steiner, for instance, Gary Lackman, but he kind of hedges that Steiner really was into something. He was onto something. He wasn't just schizophrenic, as Webb called him. Webb nailed Steiner as a kind of schizophrenic teacher. Yeah. So this, to me, this entire discussion brings up the question: can we know more than we can know? And are there techniques to help us? And is there such a thing as agents on the other side that mediums can contact to help us know these things? You know, do angels, do ascended masters, does Gurdjieff, for instance, talk to us still to this day? You know, can we contact that energy or that personality? So I'm going to ask that question to you and see how you view it.
I think the answer is no. Isn't it interesting that there was a survey, I think 3 years ago, of atheists to see what they believed. And sure enough, they 100% didn't believe in God. But 70% of them, and this was all around the world, this survey, 70% believed in the supernatural.
Yeah.
Now, if you then say, well, despite the age of reason and what was supposed to happen, a fairly small percentage of people are actually atheists. And among that percentage, there's still a belief in the supernatural. So we are dealing with something that's fundamental. There's the idea put forward by the sociologist Scott Atran, and it's a wrong idea. Let's start with that somewhere back on the savannah, it's always the savannah, isn't it? That our Homo sapiens, our species, started to create modules in the brain with which we are lumbered. There's a book by Yuval Harari, who's a historian, in fact, anthropologist, called Sapiens, which takes this nonsensical idea, I'm sorry, it is a nonsensical idea, that we are forced to behave in certain ways. So Scott Atran has the religion module, and the religion module is explained, and I find this hard, but I have read what he says, that at some point on the savannah, somebody saw a bush moving and they couldn't understand the concept of, well, the breeze, something like that. So they decided it must be a supernatural entity. And then one day a bush caught fire, maybe it was a creosote bush, and it said, I am that I am to somebody in the Hebrews. But that somehow this is like a fixed module, like a piece of hard wiring in the human brain. So we are born with this religious sense. So that's one argument. I dismiss it. I don't believe in modularity at all. The fundamental modules of the brain are, like the temporal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, which have certain functions. But because in evolutionary terms, we are not fixed. Our genes are not passed on as Dawkins has it one by one. There are combinations that occur and recombinations through natural selection. There's also sexual selection, whereby our choice of partners, where a culture, likes people with long foreheads or long necks or something, that will happen. There's also epigenetics, where a trait can be acquired in a single generation and passed on, which was the idea of Lamarck, which was very strenuously dismissed by Darwinians right into the 1970s, certainly when proof of epigenetics came out of the Swedish famine from before the First World War, showing that girls who were born during that time had smaller pelvises. So that was where it started. Since then, there's a lot of work on it. You have a situation where if a grandparent eats too much, the grandchild may become obese. And that's because of an epigenetic change. As my friend Yuval Law puts it, genes are not read-only. They can be written on. The fourth aspect of this is cultural transmission. That because we have language and we're smart, we can actually change our minds about things, and we can influence our own evolution by doing this quite evidently when you think about it. So putting that into place, once you add in these ideas of an explanation for the universe, which I think is what, I'm sort of with Mircea Eliade on this, that there's been the evolution of ideas, the evolution of religion, the evolution, and you can see natural selection taking place. If this is true, then that must be true. So take a specific question like the Donatist heresy in the Christian church. If a priest is an evil person, when they bless the sacrament, is the blessing right? Do you have the body of Christ and the blood of Christ? And the Catholic Church decided it was. And other sects decided that if the priest was not, as the Albigensians said, a parfait, a perfect person, then the sacrament was worthless.
So it could be contaminated by bad energy.
Yeah. And once you start seeing this, if this, then that, did Christ have two natures, duophysite, or what did he have? A single nature? Did he have the nature of a man and God's nature within him? And these things lead to wars and destruction and horror. But what I see is a process of logic. And once you've got a flawed piece of information in there, then the process continues.
Right.
My experience with transmediums was very limited. When I left Scientology, there was a character out there called Dr. Peebles.
Oh, yeah.
Was
19th century.
Yeah, it's supposed to be. But ex-Scientologists were clustering around this channeled Indian guru, and they were receiving all sorts of platitudes. I mean, one of the things that Peebles announced, and this was 1983, was that Ron Hubbard had died and ascended and gone off. And of course, we later found that wasn't true. It just wasn't true, because he didn't die till 1986. We also had Ramtha, and when Gordon Melton made his, as ever, entirely credulous study of Ramtha, J.Z. Knight, he didn't realize when he visited the group that there were many ex-Scientologists there who tremendously influenced the business model of this. But for me, as somebody, I'd been involved with Scientology for 9 years. I came to Scientology from Zen Buddhism, Soto Zen Buddhism, though with quite a Rinzai flavor to my own thinking. I was very devoted to the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I've since translated it character by character, and I still love it because it's not supernaturalist work. It's a way of trying to explain the universe. And in my experience is absolutely that these supernatural powers do not exist, that people believe in them so fervently that they are willing to jump from a bell tower to their death. They're willing to devote themselves to it. And there's a desperation in holding on to these ideas. So, I'm a non-believer. Let's put it.
My thinking is a little, maybe that's called fuzzy, but I think we're hardwired because of the development of language and the brain and our ability to do symbols to mistake our own symbol making for an outside agent.
Yes.
We can easily do that. And I go back to one of the longest essays I ever read called Hamlet's Mill. And it's I have the book here. I'll grab it in a second. But the authors in the mid second half of the 20th century, Santayana was one of the authors. I forget. I'll get the book in a second. But what they're looking at, Hamlet's Mill is a word for the Milky Way. That there's this great mill grinding out this white powder in the sky that the ancient man used to see. And Hamlet, in the essay, they get the name, they break it down that it comes from Amlodi, which is an ancient Babylonian story that Shakespeare somehow revisioned into his modern times with Hamlet. And Amlodi, and so they go back into myth and history, and how the origin of myth, looking at the sky and looking at things change, with life and death and the cycles, what came out of stories that ancient man told in order to help them, for instance, navigate on when to plant and when to navigate. They would tell stories about the stars, this constellation, when this appeared, this can happen. And they would tell stories of gods and goddesses to help them understand time. When something died was when that constellation disappeared from the heavens during the cycle of the Earth's moving around the sun and all of this. So when they say that some goddess died, they're actually saying the constellation is going away, So there was a fundamental reality to their storytelling. But then the storytelling takes off on its own, where stories in their own right become interesting, and they might be moral tales with no connection to the sky or to the flowers and plants, or to the cycles, which would be kind of proto-scientific, because the early man needed to survive. They needed this information to be real. When the seasons change at a certain time, when a certain constellation disappears, that had to be according to observable reality, so that they could judge when to change things, and so forth. So that eventually developed into ancient Chaldean astrology, and the old astrology was moon-based, the oldest. It wasn't sun-centered, and it was about the king or the ruler in the nation. You didn't do personal astrology. It was about the whole people and what was happening to all of us. When the heavens are changing, this is what's happening to all of us. So there was still some semblance back then of humankind responding to the real world changes with their myth making and stories, but that eventually evolved into the Ptolemaic period, when astrology got frozen into this thing that we have today. It's a monstrosity, actually, compared to what we think was going on early on, when human beings were experimenting with symbol making and language, and how to connect that with what's really going on in the world. What can help us survive, in other words, what can help us to thrive. So the essay is very interesting, Hamlet's Mill, and a lot of people criticize it because their thesis is a little odd, but I think that the basis of it is pretty good, in showing that ancient man wasn't as stupid as we thought he was, that we became stupider, as time went on, by making stories up that don't make any sense anymore. These stories used to make sense in the real world back then.
Yeah, and let's interject that as far as we know, there's been no development of the human brain since Homo sapiens first walked the earth, somewhere between 120,000 and 200,000 years ago. Yeah. So, and it's something that struck me a long time ago. I was reading a biography of King John, who is, has a very bad reputation, but in fact, when the records were opened in the 1950s, it was evident this guy had been the best of all the kings that we'd had up until that point. Maybe Alfred the Great was more of an equal to him, but most of the kings had been rapacious, like his brother Richard the Lionheart, who'd only spent one of his 10 years as king in England. He'd blown all of the money, either fighting wars or paying his ransom when he was captured. And had done nothing positive for the people. And yet we have the myth of Robin Hood and all of this, which is completely invented. But
that's a good example of how we take a story and turn it into this monstrosity compared to what the reality was. Yes. We have a tendency to do that. And, that's why these hero stories like Braveheart, did that have anything to do with the real Scotsman? Very little is sort of wrapped around that, but or Stone's JFK movie, about the conspiracy, did that have anything to do with reality? But so the myth makers in modern times can frame how people see reality when it's disconnected. This happens a lot.
I live just outside Nottingham, and people come here to see Robin Hood country.
Yes.
And the Robin Hood they're looking for was actually played by Errol Flynn in the film. Yeah. That's about when the story belongs to, as we see. But in this book on King John by W.L. Warren, historian, there was a quotation from a man called Walter Map. And I don't remember what it was. I've got the book. I must go and look it out. But it just staggered me that this man, who was writing in the 12th century, made an incredibly penetrating statement about human psychology. And it made me realize that the level of intelligence hasn't changed. Our collective memory and the science and the history that we've constructed does give us more material to deal with, but the penetrating mind has been an aspect of our species for 120,000 to 200,000 years.
Now, let me bring something up here. You're bringing up an important point, because theosophists especially want people to believe that they're tapping into something called the perennial philosophy.
Yeah.
that Pythagoras tapped into, for instance, and the Buddha and the Tao, and all these people, that there's something back there that in the golden age of human beings, they knew things like the gods knew things. I think that's a mistaken notion. It's projection backwards, and that's always a mistake to.
Yeah, induction is not the best form of reasoning.
No, but the pretense is that this particular teacher somehow, whether it's Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine or Guy Ballard's Unveiled Mysteries or whatever, that they're tapping into this ancient perennial wisdom and bringing it to us. And what's actually happening is we're getting the limitations of that particular human experience and human brain, be it Blavatsky's or Ballard's or Hubbard's. The reality is shrunk down. Whatever perennial wisdom is there is shrunk into this monstrous concoction that they call whatever it is, they label it theosophy or whatever. It's not anything to do with this perennial wisdom that's handed down like, it just can't be handed down like a brick, like somebody hands this brick down to everybody and, hey, look, we have this brick again. That's not how this works.
No, and I mean, as an aside, curiously, most Scientologists are not aware that Ron Hubbard begins with a revelation of this eternal wisdom. He said that in February 1938, he underwent a dental operation, presumably for the removal of wisdom teeth, and he was given nitrous oxide, which is...
Go on, I'll be right back. Just go on.
A pretty potent chemical. And while having this experience, he reckoned that he died for 8 minutes, and he had an out-of-body experience. And while he was away, he described this to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, and said that he was a smorgasbord, a buffet of knowledge was made open to him that mortals are not meant to see. And when he came back, he wrote a book called Excalibur, which none of us has ever seen. And that would be the beginning for him. And so, yet again, this idea that there is some, discarnate wisdom that these people tap into. There are other teachers who, the Buddha is quite good on this, that he's saying, no, you have to go and do this for yourself. You have to look for yourself. And I mean, I mentioned the poisoned arrow, and the poisoned arrow is where, if somebody is shot with a poisoned arrow, you can argue about where the poison came from or the intentions of the person,
right?
The antidote. He also said, and I think this is very important, that while there may be gods in the universe, if they were enlightened, they wouldn't be here. So they do not know the way to enlightenment. So don't listen to them, which is a very, he's very good at elegant argument, the Buddha. Though, again, I don't agree with the notion of entering nirvana. I think we have to live a good, decent social life and do the best we can for other people and have a good time while we're doing it. That's my philosophy.
Yeah, good Epicurean there.
Epicurean stoicism,
So the book I was referencing, Hamlet's Mill. And, the subtitle is an essay investigating the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through myth. I mean, calling this an essay is stretching it, right? So the book came out in 1969 originally, and I have a 1977 publication of it here. And it was written by Giorgio di Santillana and Herta von Deschend, Dechend. So it was an interesting read, I think, although there's some criticism of it, but it does a very good job of giving you the foundation of their thesis. Now you can argue with the thesis, but it does a good job of giving you a good foundation of it, so you have something to argue with. I found it fascinating. When I was breaking away from theosophy, some alcoholic film producer I met in Santa Fe told me about the book. And he was one of these seekers, and he was into the fourth way stuff in a way back then. But he turned me on to Hamlet's Mill, and I I think it helped at least get me to think that the origins of human knowledge, as espoused by Blavatsky and others, is completely wrong. She never did this kind of research to put the foundation. So you really can't argue with her, because it's out there in the mists. You have to find Joyce in the Himalayas and talk to him to really figure out what she was trying to say. And good luck with that.
Yeah. Do you know Joseph Campbell's Flight of the Wild Gander?
I haven't read it. I know of it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by Campbell. I read a dozen of his books.
Yeah.
And, it's really good material, because he's just relating myths and how they tie together. But Flight of the Wild Gander, and on my johnatak.com website, there's a 20-page of it, which was actually approved by the Campbell Foundation's president, to my amazement. I sent it to him to see if they would sue me for copyright violation, because I'm used to that. And this guy wrote back and said, no, this is great, put it up. So, but it's not a long book. It's about 150, 200 pages. And in it's his personal favorite of his books, because he takes this idea of fairy tale, folklore, mythology, and says, where do these things come from and what do they mean? And so he'll, for example, talk about the apotheosis, the deification of a particular individual. So Alexander the Great, by the time he died, was already considered a god. So you have this kind of story that comes out of heroic deeds. But of course, what you see is the expansion of these stories. So you start with, primitive man, noticing that there's thunder, and that this thunder will be called Tor or Thor in our mispronunciation of the Scandinavian. And it's not necessarily personified. It's not a god or a person. It's this force. And then the force becomes, stories start to be told. It's like, well, it sounds like a guy banging a hammer on an anvil.
Yes.
And the stories go further. I was amazed in reading Campbell and Eliade that actually I could understand the more primitive ideas. We're born out of the earth. The earth is the womb. Right. When we die, we return to the earth. And then you get these ideas of resurrection, which exist in every culture. In this country, we have John Barleycorn, the spirit of the barley, who is chopped down and buried. With manioc, with rice, with corn. You have the same story of somebody who has an ailing parent, and they meet a supernatural being, and they defeat this being 3 days running, the 3 dark days of the moon, probably, and or 3 days in the tomb. It's always 3, and bury the head of this deity, and out of that grows corn, rice, manioc, depending which culture you're going to, and that food heals the parent. So I think Campbell rather elegantly, he set out to prove the collective unconscious, Jung's rather stupid idea, and instead proved that transmission had occurred, Sumeria, Babylon, Egypt, India, China, Japan, to the Americas, that you could actually follow it. You could see that the stories had traveled. Right. And it's kind of he with the best stories wins. Well, that's what the thesis of Hamlet's Mill is. That this story that came from Chaldeans, the ancient Babylonian, migrated into what we have as Hamlet. And it's interesting how they put that together. Well, look, now you look at Torah. That when you look to the Hebrew Bible, which has its origins, there are 2 texts, probably 900 BC and 600 BC. You go way back before that to the Babylonians, and at 2500 BC, so 1500 years before, you have these ring seals, and they show the stories that will be transmuted. And we know the claim for Torah, for the Old Testament, is that Abraham came from Ur in Babylon. So these are people who are Semitic people, as the Babylonians were.
Well, the other side, Genesis has two origins combined.
Yes, 600 and 900
Genesis. There's the Elohist tradition. Now, Elohim comes from an earlier, the ancient, I don't know if Canaanites, which the Hebrews came out of. Their word for God was Elohim, which is a dual idea. It's an individual as well as a collective, like the word sheep. So it's a flexible term. So when in the Elohist tradition, when let us make man in our own image, it also means let me make man in my own image. It means both. So it's a very flexible linguistic term that a lot of people don't catch. But
if we go back into the Babylonian, then we find, and this was something that fascinated me when I was searching for it 20 years ago, that you have Asherah. You have the mother goddess, and the mother goddess, as is typical in such cases, gives birth to El, who will be the father god, and then mates with El and has, I think it's 72 children. And it keep you busy, you'd be changing a lot of nappies, diapers, that is. And among those children is Baal Marduk, who is remembered in the Hebrew Bible as a god. So there are other gods. So when the commandment says, have no other gods before me, it's an admission that there's more than one God. It's just that you're not meant to worship the other ones. Let's be careful about this. And Baal Marduk is the golden calf in the desert. And we then find that one of her other children is called Yahweh. And so that has to be cut off to make the demiurge the creator god of Jehovah or Yahweh. That fascinated me, that we can see it historically. So, for example, with the ring seals, we have the Garden of Eden myth, but what we see in the ring seals are date palms, not apples, but the Old Testament doesn't actually say apple, but not apples, date palms. That there they are. The snake is the father god inviting humanity into the garden to meet the mother goddess and to give wisdom to mankind. That story then, over 1,500 years, morphs into the father god, the tree of knowledge, which will eventually be an apple tree, and the expulsion of humanity. I think one of the cleverest things I've ever read was Maimonides, The Guide of the Perplexed, written in the...
Oh, yeah, I have it. Yeah, I've read it.
The opening paragraph is, of course, when it says we are created in the image of God, it does not mean physically. And to me, that penetrative comment that's saying there is something out there that has imagination, that has the power of thought, and that is what separates us from the other animals. So it's not that we look like God. So the Michelangelo sort of idea is blasphemous fundamentally. I mean, it's obviously...
Yeah, I think this idea, the power of thought, I don't know if animals think, if bees think, or if dogs think, their own way of perceiving, but it's the idea of projecting thought. It's projecting thought into a symbolic world. Taking paint before you go into battle and put these symbols on your cheek to give you power. No animal does that. And this is probably something that humans did early on to bring power to themselves. Wear a bear claw around their neck, the power of the bear. And
ground red ochre has been found that is 100 years old.
But no animal does that. That's the distinction to me. Yeah. In fact, Picasso, bringing this up, and I did a painting based on this idea. I have the phrase in there about Altamira. Picasso famously said, after Altamira, which is the 40,000 year ago cave paintings, in Spain, he said, after Altamira, we have invented nothing. All is decadence, which is interesting, And
when you look at those images, you can see what he meant. They're so profound.
And that's what he's meaning, is that we are only continuing to extend ourselves into a symbolic world through technology now. It's pretty elaborate. It's fascinating, but we're not doing anything different than the Altamira cave painters were doing, which was extending something beyond their brain onto an image and onto themselves, onto their bodies. You know, the fact that we make clothing, which is an old Genesis thing, you know, who told you were naked? This stuff we put on is something animals don't do. You know, I mean, they might roll in mud, for instance, and that's about as far as it goes.
Or grow a shell, or gather the shell of another creature, but it doesn't quite work out to the same.
No, it doesn't work out that way. That's you know, more like protection, but it's much different than what we're doing. You know, which is everything about style as well as protection. You know, it's far more symbolic. You know, we try to imitate nature by looking more colorful. You know, like a colorful bird or
more drab, the dandies did.
Right. We could do it that way too. But yeah, I think that, you know, this kind of discussion that we're having now is what was driving James Webb crazy at the end in his mania. And you know, you if you don't have proper guidance, you know, his wife wasn't supportive. He told Joyce here that he couldn't find anyone else to turn to talk about this stuff because he was having these insights, you know. And of course, she lived till she was 91, died in 2010. She was an astrologer at the end. She was friendly with a theosophist, but again, call no man master. She followed teachers, but she didn't follow masters. That was her way of distinguishing.
Which is a quotation from Jesus: "Call no man on earth your master. Call no man on earth your teacher. Call no man on earth your father," which is Matthew 23, I think. Right.
So in a sense, she settled into a comfortable occult world, you know, for herself, and was essentially, you know, gave out advice astrologically and whatever. But it didn't defeat her. It didn't crush her mind. It didn't drive her crazy. You know, it did for a while. After she left TM, she had a psychotic breakdown. And after that experience with the Maharishi, it took her 10 years to be a creative writer again. She was well published as a writer of fiction before, when she was young, and she lost her creative abilities because of TM and her connection to the Maharishi. You know, so she did suffer the damage, and that's what Webb was interested in. But he came at this from the outside. He wasn't an inside experiencer. And so, you know, not realizing experientially how effective this stuff is to get into your head, because you're wrestling with angels, you know, and who's going to win? Well, the angels are going to win, you know, because there's nothing there. You know, and in his case, the demons in his mind, the existential angst. You know, one story I'll tell you with Webb at the end, he was so upset with not knowing what it was all about. He ran out of his building that he was living in. He waded across the river, and he ran 12 miles to a cathedral. I forget the name of it now, but I wrote it in my review. And he was pounding on the door, wanting to get in, to get some kind of feeling answered, but it was locked. He couldn't get in. You know, this is how desperate the man was, and you could see it's a form of you know, it's a disturbance. Obviously, he was just out there, but he wasn't. And he was aware of the delusional thinking he was having. In his letters, you could see it. But then he was also aware of the seeker, the philosophical explanations that he was doing as well, which he couldn't come to grips with. You know, at one point he was in a fetal position at this institute where he was being treated, just yelling, "What's it all about? What's it all about? You know, what's it all about?" And you know, if you want to ask that question, you can ask that ad infinitum as a human being, and you will stay in a fetal position.
Yeah,
you know, waiting for the answer.
Do you know Julian Jaynes' idea of the bicameral mind?
Bicameral mind, yeah.
Which it's such a tempting thought that because there are certain parts of the brain has it mirrors, so that you've got an area on each side. But when you come to the language areas, they're not mirrored. And so his thought was that the gods used to speak directly to people, and that part of the brain would be this kind of sense of an external direction. So they would hear, you know, Pallas telling them to do things and what have you. It's an amusing idea. And certainly, I think the idea that we can develop a separated self, and I'm not a believer in dissociative identity disorder in a big way. I'm not a believer in multiple personality disorder, save that these can definitely be created in people. I say definitely because I know two people who read the book When Rabbit Howls, about allegedly has 99 distinct personalities.
Over 200.
I'm sorry?
Over 200. She had over 200
in the end. Oh
yeah.
I've given short shrift here. Both of these women, having read this book and talked about it together, began to develop separated identities. Right. And it was I was close to it. I lived around it for months.
Well, I work in a psych hospital. These people come in regularly. They go to some therapist that believes in DID, or dissociative identity disorder, as they call it, and they wear it like a badge, like it tells them who they are, and then they try to behave this way when I'm doing intake with them at the psych hospital, because now they're suicidal for whatever reason, and the little child comes out and I listened to it for a while. I go, listen, I'm just asking you to answer a simple question. What is your social security number? And they come back. It's interesting. They come back to themselves.
Yeah.
Just from the simple question. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it is possible for us to develop in that way. And I see, we've both met an awful lot of people who believe extreme and extraordinary things, and they live within that system. They have come to believe certain things, and the world is now interpreted in terms of those things. So, I've had a couple of friends who are astrologers, and I can't make head nor tail of that. One of them went to somebody, her teacher, and wrote this incredible 20-page thing about me. This was 30 years ago. And I was, wow, this actually some of this is quite real. And then I discovered that she'd written it. And and that, of course, she knew me. So, of course, she was saying, oh, he's a writer. He's like, there wasn't anything very prophetic about it when she realized that it wasn't a stranger who'd done it, but somebody who knew you. And you to then get into the arguments as to why these particular planets should have this particular influence. And to me, it's anything that negates our ability of choice, our ability, our will, our free will, as some would call it, I am very suspicious of. I don't accept any argument that takes away from us responsibility in the decisions we make.
Yeah, you know what this brings to mind? You read Eliotti's Ordeal by Labyrinth. It's a series of essays.
No, I haven't.
About his exploration into his work. The title Ordeal by Labyrinth is a reference to the myth of the slaying of the Minotaur. Who was that god? Who was that hero that did that? He used Ariadne's thread. Ariadne gave him a thread.
Yeah, and he keeps it.
And he keeps it because to go down into the labyrinth, slay the Minotaur, you have to find a way out. And he does, with that help, with that help, you have to reason, in other words, something tangible to help you out of this. And I think that's the danger in what happened to Webb. He got into that labyrinth of thinking, and he didn't really have a connection to anyone but Joyce, and she wasn't a great connection to pull him out because she was immersed in it herself.
Yeah.
And so in other words, he got in over his head. He didn't have a thread of reality to help him get out. Now had he not taken the gun and blown his head off, maybe he would have survived that, quote, initiation, as the esotericists call it, and come out the other end and wrote even a more brilliant book, about this whole thing. But unfortunately, he succumbed to suicide.
And there's so little out there to help somebody who's having this sort of problem. I have a psychologist friend who said that her favorite book is The Doctor and the Soul by Viktor Frankl, who's very well known for Man's Search for Meaning, talking about his time in Dachau and Auschwitz. But he said there's this terrible gap now, this rift between psychology and spirituality. And if people do have a spiritual belief, then it's no good doing what I've just done and trashing it. You have to let them explain their paradigm, their metaphor for the world. And for me, when I left Scientology, I very quickly came to this thing, because I didn't believe it anymore, but I was talking with people who did, which I called the meta paradigm. That in dealing with somebody, you have to work with what they believe and not impose your beliefs on them. Rollo May, the existential therapist, would say, basically, your worldview is wrong, mine is right. I'm going to inject my, and it's we see this to some extent with street epistemology, with the militant atheists who are so convinced of the rightness of their beliefs, and they are beliefs, they aren't in fact immortal, eternal truths, that they will seek to impose them on others through a fairly simplistic scheme of reasoning. I think that it's necessary to go to the place where the person lives, so with James Webb, to find out what they believe and to then help them to reconsider that perspective. For me, I was very delighted when I found that Erich Fromm called himself an atheist mystic.
By the way, Webb refers to Fromm often to help him come to grips with some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I take the same position. I, for years, have called myself an agnostic mystic, because I do absolutely respect the tradition of mysticism as we find it, say, with the Sufis in Islam, through Buddhism, through Lao Tzu, Meister Eckhart and Molinos in the Christian tradition, Thomas Traherne. There are all sorts of insights that these people offer. When Eckhart says, anything that can be said about God will not be true. It's a lovely statement. And he says, the eyes to which I see God are the eyes to which God sees me. So I have a tremendous respect for this as an attempt to understand reality. And often in reading, more modern psychologists, I despair at their lack of understanding, because they have tried to reduce our sort of aesthetic, our symbolism, our culture, our way. We do have mind. We don't simply have brain. And so even though I'm an agnostic and I don't believe in an afterlife, or I certainly don't want to go to heaven, it sounds awfully boring. And I think also that if you had any compassion whatsoever, you'd have to go to hell to try and help the people there, and try and maybe talk to God about being a bit nicer to people.
Well, good luck with that. By the way, I just finished watching the entire series out of Korea on Netflix called Hellbound. And it's a fascinating, it's really trending high right now. And it's really well done. It's in subtitles, of course, in English, but it's modern current times. And the framework of the story is that there's this young man who is confused about stuff. He goes into bed or whatever, and he sees this vision, which is real, of these three dark beings taking this other being and sending him to hell, sending this being to hell. And he later has more experiences about this, and then he realizes that there's some random thing going on where this supernatural force, like an angel they call it, is telling people when they're going to die and then killing them at that very instance with these demons. And it happens to him. He sees the vision out there that he's going to die at a certain time in 20 years from then. So what he does is decides that he's got to do something with this in order to help people. So he makes up a myth about what this is, because people are having these experiences. And he's saying that this is God's way of showing you that sin sends you to hell, when sin has nothing to do with this. It's just a prediction of your death, that you will go to hell. And so he's using this as the guru now to start a new movement called the New Truth, which will convince people to live a good life and not sin anymore. But then, of course, other people figure out that this isn't what's going on here. People are dying that are sinless. And then finally, there's a vision of a baby being told this, and then people are recording this on their phones, and it goes viral, of these angels appearing out of ethers, and they're more demonic than angelic. So the story's interesting. It develops over 6 episodes that the new religion becomes like a fascist state with its own enforcers beating people up, called the Arrowhead, that don't believe in it. And I won't give away the punchline at the end, but it's fascinating how it ends, because it leaves an open question, about what reality is. And it does question Christianity in a certain subtle way, about its essence, and what original sin is, because this new group doesn't believe in original sin, but now they got to think about it, because now this thing is killing babies. And why would they die? Because they haven't sinned yet, So it's a fascinating series about these questions we're bringing up. But a psychiatrist that I know from India was watching it, and he told me about it at work, and so I binged on it over the weekend and watched the whole thing.
I'll have a look at it.
Yeah, take a look at it. It's worth a look because of the deep existential questions it brings up about religion. Yeah.
Well,
and it's entertaining.
Yeah, and I think that entertainment is an important part of it. It's probably why Zoroastrianism's Zend-Avesta is not much read,
right?
More like a telephone directory, and so where are the great stories? I looked into Cherokee mythology specifically. I've been interested in Native American ideas for a long time. I was a hippie, after all.
Of course.
And so I wrote a novel about Jimi Hendrix called Voodoo Child's Slight Return, and I wanted to bring him back to life. But to understand him, you had to, I felt, understand the tradition of the blues and the oppression of Black people in the United States, but also his Cherokee ancestry. And people tend to know that he was an 8th blood Cherokee, so could claim to be a member of the tribe. He was also an 8th blood Irishman, and claimed to be part of that tribe too. But so in reading the Cherokee myths, I became fascinated by particular stories, which I then used in the novel. So I have a kind of New Age cult group living in the home counties around London. They're all stockbrokers and what have you, who have heard this story of the Canasta people, these people who, according to Cherokee myth, disappeared through a gateway in a mountain, and if the sun catches the mountain in the right place, you can see the gateway. They believe that they are reincarnated from the Canasta, and they discover the Ulan Suti, which is this jewel with supernatural powers, which is found in Cherokee mythology. But while I did find Cherokee mythology fascinating, it seemed to be very simple when compared with the developed ideas of Greek mythology, Viking mythology, or Hebrew mythology. And that made me think about Shakespeare, because there isn't an original story in Shakespeare. His histories all come from Holinshead, and he picked up plays from other people. King Lear had actually been published less than a year before he picked it up and rewrote it. And it's that idea that to elaborate on something can take it further, and that when we look at these stories as they came from Sumeria through Babylon, they are elaborated upon to the extent that we can even see sometimes, say with Iranian and Indian mythologies, we find on one side a god is positive to the one people and negative to the other. So that there's been some sort of interchange.
Yeah, what we hope for is in the elaboration, there's also refinement with a certain elegance, so that it elevates how we view things. We don't always find that in the new religions and cults. There's a kind of a reinventing of the wheel in a very crude way by a lot of new cult leaders, and as a result, people collapse back into a shrunken reality. It isn't as refined as you would wish. So listen, I've got to get going.
The original moral may be completely lost. So the notion of the Mother Goddess welcoming humanity into the Garden of Eden, which is the paradise where we are living right now, turns to be an expulsion from Eden, and the idea that women will henceforth give birth in pain as a punishment for what their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother did, which does seem a bit mean. And the idea of original sin, which, as you probably know, that the Islam does not have the idea of original sin, and they don't accept it. And they also have a beautiful story, which is that Allah creates humanity to enjoy his beauty.
Yeah,
it's just a lovely thought, rather than to be punished and bullied and knocked about. Sadly, things do go a little bit wrong after that, but
well, men will be men.
Yeah, and and we will bend the stories to our own means. So when Ezra comes along in the 5th century and pretty much invents Judaism as we have it today, it's a relatively modern thing, then everything is moved to fit into his belief. So there is only one temple, and that is in Jerusalem. That's the only place. There are no synagogues until much later.
John, I've got to go.
Yeah, and you've got to go. And this has been a fascinating discussion as ever.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Yeah. And I'll send you a link to the book review. It's on my webpage, so you can.
We'll post that alongside this. So
all right,
it's great. Let's switch off our recorders and book another date. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. It all depends how you find Boogie as well. She's on the Zimmer now.